In the winter of 1610, soldiers arrived at a remote castle in the Kingdom of Hungary, expecting to investigate rumors. What they found instead would echo through history as one of the most terrifying criminal cases ever documented. Inside the stone walls of Székely Castle lived Countess Elizabeth Báthory, a powerful noblewoman born into one of the most influential families in Eastern Europe. She was educated, multilingual, and politically connected. Nothing about her public status suggested horror. Yet whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Young servant girls had been sent to the castle for work and refinement, but many were never seen again. Villagers spoke of screams piercing the night air. Some claimed they saw bodies carried out under darkness. When the royal investigator, György Thurzó, finally entered the castle, reports described dead and dying girls hidden within its chambers, some bearing signs of severe abuse. Testimonies collected from witnesses and servants painted a portrait so brutal that even centuries later it unsettles historians. Elizabeth Báthory would soon be accused of torturing and killing dozens, possibly hundreds, of young women. Her trial became one of the earliest documented serial murder cases in European history. But here is what makes the story even darker. She was never formally executed. Instead, she was sealed alive inside her own castle. The question that still haunts history is whether she was truly a monstrous killer, or a powerful woman destroyed by political enemies who needed her land and silence. The walls of Székely Castle did not speak, but the servants eventually did, and what they described turned rumor into nightmare. Under interrogation, several witnesses testified that the Countess's cruelty was not sudden but gradual, escalating over years behind closed doors. At first, punishments for minor mistakes were said to be harsh but not unusual for the era. Then the beatings grew more severe. Girls accused of clumsiness were allegedly stripped and left in freezing courtyards during winter. Others were reported to have been burned with heated irons, cut with knives, or forced to endure prolonged starvation. Some testimonies claimed the Countess herself participated directly, watching with cold detachment, or worse, fascination. One servant described how screams echoed through corridors late into the night, while others spoke of bodies secretly buried near the castle grounds. The most infamous accusation, that Elizabeth Báthory bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, appeared later in retellings, and historians debate whether it was propaganda designed to sensationalize her image. Still, even stripped of myth, the surviving court records are chilling enough. Witnesses swore under oath that dozens of girls had died within those walls. A ledger allegedly listing victims was mentioned during proceedings, though it was never officially presented in court. Whether exaggerated or not, the sheer consistency of testimonies formed a pattern too disturbing to dismiss. And as investigators gathered statements, the shadow around the Countess grew darker, transforming a noblewoman into what some would call the Blood Countess. When the investigation against Elizabeth Báthory reached its peak, Europe expected a public execution worthy of the crimes described, but that moment never came. Instead, what followed was something far more politically complex. As testimonies mounted and pressure from the crown increased, Count György Thurzó moved swiftly to contain the scandal. Báthory was arrested in 1610, yet she was never subjected to a formal public trial like her alleged accomplices. Her servants were interrogated, tortured, and ultimately executed for their roles in the crimes. They confessed to assisting in acts of brutality, naming the Countess as the central figure. But Elizabeth herself, protected by her noble bloodline and powerful relatives, was spared the humiliation of appearing before a court. Officially, the Hungarian nobility feared that a public trial would damage the reputation of one of their most influential families. Unofficially, some historians suggest another motive. Báthory controlled vast lands and wealth. Executing her would have complicated inheritance and political stability in the region. Instead, a compromise was reached. She would be punished, but quietly. In 1611, Elizabeth Báthory was sealed inside a small chamber within her own castle. Windows were bricked up, leaving only a narrow opening to pass food and water. There would be no public spectacle, no executioner's blade. She would vanish from society without bloodshed, at least officially. 4 years later, in 1614, she was found dead in that darkened room. Whether monster or political casualty, her fate ensured one thing: the legend would grow far beyond the stone walls that confined her. Centuries after her death, Elizabeth Báthory remains suspended between two terrifying possibilities. Either she was one of the most prolific female serial killers in recorded history, or she was the victim of a calculated political conspiracy designed to strip her of power and land. On one side stand the testimonies, multiple servants confessing under oath, describing torture, mutilation, and secret burials within castle grounds. Records from the investigation mention dozens of victims, and later sources inflated that number to more than 600, though the higher figure remains historically disputed. On the other side stands a troubling context. Báthory was a wealthy widow controlling enormous estates in a region entangled in political tension between Hungarian nobles and the Habsburg crown. Removing her quietly would benefit powerful men who owed her family debts and feared her influence. Some historians argue that much of the more sensational horror, especially the infamous blood-bathing legend, appeared decades later, shaped by folklore and moral panic. Torture was also commonly used to extract confessions during this era, raising questions about the reliability of witness statements. There was no full public trial, no opportunity for her to defend herself, no preserved ledger of victims conclusively verified. What remains are fragments, testimonies, political letters, rumors, and silence. And that silence is perhaps the most unsettling element of all, because if she was innocent, then history transformed a noblewoman into a monster. But if she was guilty, then one of the darkest killers in European history died without ever facing true justice. Long after Elizabeth Báthory's body was discovered in her sealed chamber in 1614, her story refused to remain buried with her. Instead, it grew darker with time. Writers, poets, and later Gothic novelists transformed her from a disgraced noblewoman into something almost supernatural. The Blood Countess, a vampiric figure obsessed with youth and immortality. The infamous claim that she bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty, though absent from early trial records, became the defining image attached to her name. In the centuries that followed, her legend blended with Eastern European vampire folklore, inspiring horror literature and shaping the archetype of the aristocratic predator long before modern serial killer narratives existed. Yet beneath the myth lies an uncomfortable truth. The historical documents remain incomplete, fragmented, and filtered through political agendas. Some scholars today argue that she may have been brutal but not uniquely monstrous for her time. while others insist the scale of accusations cannot be dismissed as fabrication. What is undeniable is this: Elizabeth Báthory became a symbol of unchecked power, of violence hidden behind nobility, and of how history can magnify fear into immortality. Whether she tortured dozens, hundreds, or far fewer than claimed, her name endures more than 4 centuries later. And perhaps that is the final horror, that even if the walls of Shete Castle have fallen silent, the story of the Blood Countess continues to echo, asking us whether monsters are born or made by the telling of their tale.